I feel like we've welcomed back almost everybody. Some people might still be recharging their glasses and on their way in, but I'm sure they'll join us soon. It's my pleasure to be joined by Eliza Clark for this next session. So we're going to be, again, having a conversation about Eliza's work, but we're going to start with a reading.
Yes, I'm going to go up to the lectern as well. I was going to sit down, but then I felt quite inspired by Rose using the lectern, and also it means that you can't tell that I'm reading off my phone. So we're going to be talking about my novels, which are Boy Parts and Penance, which some of you might have read. But I don't typically like to read from them, just because they're a bit. Boy Parts is this sort of long monologue with a lot of long, quite graphic sections that I don't necessarily enjoy reading in public, but it's hard to find a stop point. And Penance, only the first chapter is easy to read to people who aren't familiar with it, and the first chapter is by some distance the most graphic thing in the book. So I try not to inflict a description of a child being burned to death on people. So I'm going to be reading from my short story collection tonight, and I'm going to be reading an extract from the title story, which is She's Always Hungry. I'm going to be dropping in just a sort of a little bit of a ways into this. So a little bit of context for this story is it is set in a fishing village in Northumberland sometime in the past, which is heavily matriarchal, and there seems to be some strange presence in the water which is affecting the behaviour of the men in the village. So I'm going to start reading that right now. I also said that I was sort of doing this to obscure my phone, but the text is actually quite small, so I'm going to... Professionalism. Okay, I am going to start now. I didn't know why they'd want to get a man deaf, but I knew my place and I did not ask questions. If the mothers wanted us to know something, they'd tell us. That was good enough for me. I was one of the best boys. People were always telling my mammy that, and I protected that reputation. As much as I worked for it, I was good by nature too, and I had always been a good boy. Despite my youth, the other men have looked to me as a peacemaker. Some even said I could have come just from my mother alone, with no man's blood or seed in sight to spoil me. I was told the man who had fathered me was meek and gentle, and that I was well bred. I was told that he had long since gone to the sea, that his name was also John, but I can't remember which mother he belonged to, so he is as good as lost to me. Our Mary Samuel was not well bred, my mother often told me. Our Mary was too impatient for a daughter, and she did not put in the effort to negotiate with the mother of a good man to get one. Though our Mary had 3 children, her Samuel and her Brogan and her Melinda, and my mammy only had me, I was born too late for her to have another. It was a disappointment not to have a girl, but she didn't want to put a bad man out into the world. Being the mother to a bad man was a worse sin than being daughterless. My sacrifice is lauded, Mammy told me, and our Mary's greed for daughters making up a bad son has been noted by the mothers. She'll never see a day as head of our house. The mothers told us we would not see our Mary Samuel for several days, so Mammy sent me to get fish for our Mary and her Brogan and Melinda. I went out on the boat with a net, and Rosie Andrews' John came to help. It was a gentle day, but our Brogan told me to be careful not to go too far out onto the water. Don't feel the need to overfish for her. If the weather turns, come back to me, she said. I'll be here on the shore with a line. Thank you, I told her. And the same goes for you, Rosie's John. We got on the little boat and we watched our Brogan set up a fishing pole as we paddled out. We watched her get smaller and smaller as we floated into the sea. We did as we were told and did not go out too far. We set out the net and hauled up a fish. Rosie Andrews' John asked me if I knew what was wrong with Mary Mountjoy's Samuel. Well, if the mothers needed us to know, they'd tell us, I know that, but we're out there earshot for the time, so what do you know? What do you think if you don't know now? Well, I don't know now, and I don't know now I'm not supposed to know, and I don't think out about it. Well, do you want me to tell you what I know? Because I know things. My mummy's brother told me. You know, our Maggie's Gerald. Maggie Andrews as Gerald had a high status among men on account of the fact he had lived to be over 60 before the sea took him. He was a mentor and a helper to many of us. He was gentle, and because of his nature and his long life, he was often privy to knowledge that many men would not live to collect. I did not say anything. My curiosity felt with my desire to be pure of anything I had not been given by our mothers. The machinations of men had done so little for this place and for the world outside of here. There's something in the water here that takes the men, he said. We all go to the water eventually. Not the water itself, Daphne, something in the water. Something what calls out to her, drives her mad and takes her. We've all heard tell of finwives luring fishermen from their women, and those are just children's stories. No, said Rosie Andrews John, you're not listening to us, because this isn't some finwife or siren story. It's not some folk tale. It's in your head. It gets in your head and it brings you down with it. Maybe to make you a slave. Sounds an awful lot like a finwife story to me. Maybe to eat you. We don't know. Maggie's Gerald said that we'd lost a lot of men that way. Some women too. Sometimes getting bread helped rid the afflicted. But any babe born by a man or woman with a thing inside their head came out wrong. With gills. I've never seen a baby with gills. Well, they put them in the water and they swim away. I winced when he talked about breeding. I tried not to think about it. Men who thought too much about getting bread became strange and disrespectful with their eyes. They tried to lure good women into secret trysts which their mothers did not know about. I looked over to our Brogan on the rock and saw her reeling in a fish. She was paying us no mind and certainly could not hear us, but voices carry on the wind. I feel sorry for your Rosie Andrews, you know, because that is one of the most wet-brained things I've ever been told. I think if my son was coming out with such a salty mess as that, I'd send him out to sea with a net and hope he got stuck in it, I said. Rosie Andrews as John glared at me. I heard you reeled in something funny last week, John, he hissed. I heard you was on the water alone and you reeled in something dead funny. I smacked him, so he punched me hard in the arm and I lost my balance and fell from the boat. I had fallen from much bigger boats into much rougher seas, so I did not panic. I tried to let myself float upward, but my ankle was caught in our net. And while I was under, I heard it whisper to me. I heard it clear as day, as if there were no water to catch the words. I heard my catch of the day calling out to me from where I was keeping it. John, 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 John. A chorus. Rosie Andrews as John pulled me up, and when I surfaced, I could hear our Brogan shouting from the rock. We came back to shore with a boat full of fish, and Brogan slapped our wrists for fighting. She sent Rosie Andrews as John home and had me warm up by the fire while she gutted the fish. Our Melinda deboned them and our Mary salted them, and they had me take the fish out to the smokehouse, where I hung them up to dry.
Thank you. So this short story that you just read, this is for a work in progress of a
It's from
new
the
book.
forthcoming collection, actually. So it's coming out in November, and it's called She's Always Hungry, and that was the title story from the collection, which is coming out in November.
So we'll return to short stories. We'll get there eventually, but we should probably rewind a bit, I reckon, and perhaps we'll start with Boy Parts. We'll sort of have a chronological conversation. So Boy Parts, your debut novel, and a very powerful and disorientating and deeply kind of weird in places, but also like amazing novel.
Thank you.
Also very disturbing in places too, I think. Certainly there's reality shifts at play there. Did you start off with Boy Parts as a novel? Did it also start as a short story? What was the evolution?
It did actually.
Did it?
So yeah, I was on like a mentorship scheme with New Writing North. So I had graduated university, moved back up to Newcastle. I went to art school in London, and it didn't work out. So I moved back to Newcastle and worked in retail for 3 years. And I applied for a job at New Writing North, which I didn't get, but they liked me enough at the interview that they called me back and asked me if I wanted to, essentially if I wanted some money for there was a sort of pot of funding ring fence for writers aged 18 to 25, which I think at the time was the Northern Rock Talent Fund, but is now the New Writers Talent Fund, because Northern Rock is obviously long since dead, and I'm not that old. It was just a lot of money that they had left over from Northern Rock. And part of this was I trained as a facilitator and did some teaching for their Cuckoo Young Writers group, and then the other half of it was I was mentored by a writer called Matt Wesolowski, and I wrote a lot of short stories under his mentorship. So I'd already started kind of sort of the process of writing more and more original fiction. When I was a teenager, I used to write a lot of fan fiction. That was basically how I got into writing. But during university and after graduating, excuse me, I started working on a little bit more original fiction, and I got and it was really, really useful to have the sort of guidance of a one-to-one mentor there, because I was able to, I guess it's just good to have the stability. So I would basically write a story and I would give it to Matt, and then Matt would give me some feedback on it. And then I would usually sit out in the cafe that we'd met at and then work on the story with his feedback. And we did that for like months. And Boy Parts was originally a 15,000 word short story, which is not a short story and not a novel, and is actually completely useless. If you're familiar at all with sort of writing competitions or submission guidelines, it's like 5,000 is usually the cutoff. So it was like really finishing it and being like fucking useless. Great. But it was very exciting to write, and it was fun, and I wanted to, this was like right toward the end of the mentorship scheme as well, and I'd probably written like maybe like 6 or 7 short stories, some of which have survived into this collection, but quite a few haven't. And I sort of wanted to have a go at writing a novel, basically. So I thought that was the one that made the most sense to kind of expand out, because it was so long anyway. And it also had quite a clear like 3-act structure. So if you've read Boy Parts, but if you haven't, it basically starts with the protagonist Irina at her day job, which is at a bar, and you find out that she's a photographer, and she's very dissatisfied with the fact that she works at a bar because she thinks that she is a genius and should not be working at a bar. Where I can't imagine where I got that from. I was incredibly angry when I wrote this book. And then the middle act is that she kind of gets, and then she gets invited to an exhibition in London, which is like potentially a big life-changing, career-reviving deal for her. The middle act is her sort of finding her muse and kind of taking photos with him, and their relationship becoming closer and closer, and then the end of the novel is her in London after kind of blowing up this relationship that she'd had, and having a gallery show and it not quite going as she expected. And that structure was in place basically in the short story. That's what the short story was. And building it into a novel was a sort of a matter of thinking about why she was like that, because she's horrible. And sort of, I guess, mapping her autobiography and building out her world a little bit. So it's stuff like she has like a close friend that is very present and important in the novel, and her mother particularly is present and important in the novel, but they were just completely absent from the short story collection.
That's really interesting.
Short story.
Yeah, because they're so, they're so central when you get to the novel. So yeah, I can't imagine it without them, really.
Yeah.
And Irina, she is horrible, but she's also really funny.
Yes.
She definitely has her moments, and reading the book, I really felt like you're sort of inside her head almost, seeing the thoughts as they play out. It's very much, the narrative is very much like you're with her the entire time. And at least initially that's fairly clear in terms of what's going on and what are the thoughts, the things she's imagining, reflecting on and doing. But it doesn't really remain that way. It sort of is transgressive in the way in which the thoughts sort of mutate, isn't it? And I couldn't really tell at times whether things were happening or not. And I'm not sure that Irina could either.
No, it's a good get out of jail free card as well when you decide that you've got an unreliable narrator, and that you don't necessarily. is it a plot hole or is it unreliable? So I'd recommend if you're taking a crack at writing a first novel and you don't necessarily want it to be this intricate, tightly plotted thing, unreliable first-person narrator.
But you do, there's clue, I mean, you know, as it goes through, there are clues to things that will happen later and they don't really reveal themselves till later, and you're like, oh, that's really clever, that bit. And then you've got the bits where, it obviously gets super dark. So Irina, she's a photographer. She's not really in the bar for long, is she? She's only in the bar in the book for like one shift or something.
Yeah.
And then she goes off sick.
Yes, she manipulates her way into being on sabbatical after being slapped by a customer who is the mother of a underage boy she had taken photographs of while thinking that he was slightly older because he'd used his brother's passport. Which had been interesting because I'm working on an adaptation for television at the minute, which probably isn't ever going to go into production, but I've written the first 2 episodes. And the first 2, in that first scene, we really had to tone Irina's personality down because it was just kind of like, we came like screaming out the gate with her being quite similar to the way she is on the page. And it's just a little bit too much for a TV show to start with somebody being accused of producing child pornography and then being a real bitch about it. So we had to wind it in just a little bit.
Well, it's a strange combination of things at that moment because on one hand she's got a conscience because she's like, well, I always ID everyone. But then, you know, you've got these like really submissive sort of, you know, situations for the sitter, you know, or, well, anyway, it gets super dark, doesn't it? And it gets so dark that you're not really sure whether or not there's murder involved.
Yes.
I mean, are people, you know, did that happen? You know, I really love that moment where all of a sudden it sort of goes from a photographer that's taking photographs that are, you know, effectively always men in very submissive situations, but the violence is real rather than made up. And people are loving it, you know, people are really loving this work. They're like, this is incredible, it's the most genuine, you know, I don't know how you do it. And, you know, obviously, it's the strangulation marks are real strangulation marks, you know, and all this stuff's going on. But then all of a sudden you shift it into a completely different gear, and all of a sudden we're into maybe Irina is a murderer. And as I was reading this, I was just thinking, where on earth did this come from? You know, because it kind of starts out, and also there's lots of like texting people and that stuff going on as well. So you really are in like, this is what I'm texting people, this is what I'm getting back. Someone who's completely in control of their life. Were you drawing on all kinds of people you knew? Were you, I mean, not murderers, but you know, were you drawing on all kinds of people you knew to form that character, or were you having to research a huge amount to get there?
I think I was drawing on. I'd read quite a lot of horrible woman books before I wrote Boy Parts. I think I was the thing that people tend to compare it to is American Psycho. I've even had people describe it as a rip-off of American Psycho, which isn't true. It's a rip-off of Tampa by Alyssa Nutting, which is the book which is the book that I read probably. I read it in like, I'd like fallen out of reading. I'd kind of really, really fallen out of love with fiction reading during my English literature A-level, which I think is a lot of people do. And I hadn't read anything. I hadn't read fiction for years. I was just tending to read like non-fiction. To be honest, I was tending to read the same 5 John Ronson books over and over and over again on Audible. And it was like one of the first fiction books I probably read after like, if you want to be a writer, you need to start reading again, proper fiction books. So I read Tampa and I thought it was amazing, and it was like the best thing that I'd ever read ever. And then while sort of around the time that I was working with Matt, he recommended that I read The End of Alice by A.M. Holmes. And I was also a huge fan of the Michael Haneke film, The Piano Teacher, which is also a novel by Elfriede Jelinek, but I, to be honest, I prefer the film. The book's great, but I do prefer the film. And it was sort of this like kind of mash of influences coming together that like, I wrote this sort of long short story, which the initial spark for the short story version of Boy Parts was the music video for Boys by Charlie XCX, which which I saw and I was like, yeah, that put a story somehow. I guess all of this kind of weird mush of influences came together. So I get the American Psycho thing. I'm sure it's definitely there in the genetics. It just wasn't the initial germ.
Oh, that's great. I love that. There's a couple of other characters that I really love in the book. The guy from Tesco.
Yes.
So a sort of unlikely love interest to begin with, for all manner of reasons, and yet something about that did kind of work for a little while. It must have been fun developing him and what went on there, because he has to go through quite a lot, doesn't he? Irina is not easy on him, it has to be said.
Yes, I think that was sort of my favorite part of the book. I think is the Eddie from Tesco stuff. I think that's kind of the best stuff in it. I really took pains to make sure that I only ever referred to him as Eddie from Tesco as well. And I remember when I was reading out because I read the audiobook of Boy Parts, that reading through the manuscript in full for the first time since it had been published, and then realizing that there was one instance where I just call him Eddie instead of Eddie from Tesco, and being like, for fuck's sake. Yes, I think he's my favorite character in it. And I think I sort of say that the three main characters in Boy Parts are kind of all heavily derived from like different aspects of myself. So I sort of think of if Irina is like rage and ego, then Eddie is sort of pathetic vulnerability and the need to be loved, but also self-loathing. And I don't know, I really had fun with that character, and I'd been like, some of my like earliest original fiction, like the earliest stuff that I was trying to write was, I'd been working on a short story that was basically like, I was trying to do The Piano Teacher, but set in a high school, because I was like 18 when I tried writing it. And I think it was just, there's something really, really interesting I found in that dynamic of a dominant woman and like a weird submissive man that I just found so interesting. I think because it's obviously subversive, but there's also, it's subversive, it's transgressive, but there's also just so much room for it to go wrong because of society, because of the sort of established power dynamic that like, how far can you push like a man's tolerance for humiliation? How far can you push essentially when you're a person who's sort of statistically and socio-politically vulnerable to violence? And I just thought that was something really, really interesting about that. And I think this sort of weird power dynamic stuff has been in my work since I was like a teenager, since I was writing weird fan fiction. I
sort of hope he met someone nice after, though, Eddie, because he's so lovable and he's treated so badly, and then he's kind of out of the story, because he just cannot put up with any more. It's done.
I had an abandoned short story, which I abandoned because it was too sad, which I had like jokingly it's like saved on my laptop as like the Boy Parts holiday special, where it's like in the opening like couple of thousand words is basically Eddie from Tesco arguing with his manager at work, who's being racially microaggressive to him about whether he's allowed to finish early on Christmas Eve so he can drive to Northumberland to his parents' house, and that he turns on the radio and they play like Love Hurts, and then he pulls into a lay-by and cries for 20 minutes. And then I thought, I can't do this. I just need to leave this poor man alone.
Oh, there's no happy ending for
No
Eddie
happy ending.
Tesco. But you'll want there to be, and if you've read it, I'm sure you do. But there's. I was just thinking then, because I was thinking about one other character, but there's so many. But one of the ones I really love is her now successful mate, who's like, I helped you, and it's like it's this horrible thing. But I'm sure I've met that person. I'm sure we all have. But she's brilliantly observed, that this character. So this is someone that, they were at university together, and then this other character, she goes off and becomes massively famous and sort of knows all the galleries, and she's making loads of money. Meanwhile, Irina's working in a bar, still waiting really for her moment when things will shine. And then they meet up again after years. And this is already well into the unhinged Irina. Not that she's that hinged to begin with, but like really unhinged. And the sort of, is it a dinner? I think they're having dinner.
Yes. They go for a Brick Lane curry, I believe.
Yeah, and it's kind of normal at first, and they're just having a normal conversation, and then at this point there's these slips into like just being really rude, and they're just like, did I say that in my mind, or did I actually just say that? That must have been, was that really fun to play with Irina, or were you sometimes writing it and also thinking, oh my God, she's awful?
A bit of both, really. I think it's like, I think particularly the humor of Boy Parts was really fun. I think because, I don't know, I feel like naturally I can have quite a sort of spiky sense of humor, and that it's almost like a little bit of an intrusive thought where I'll think something awful and think that was really funny, but I'm not going to say that aloud because that's bullying. And it was sort of just being able to, what if all of those thoughts that I'd ever had were just put down on a page through the realm of a fictional character that I have that I don't endorse. There was a really funny early review of Boy Parts, which it was like the Manchester Review of Books gave it to a Catholic priest, and his take on it was that he sort of thought that Boy Parts was kind of useful as like a morality play, as like here's what happens when you when you take loads of drugs and have loads of sex and don't settle down and sort of find God. But I remember there was a really funny offhanded line where it was like, and you could see with our friend Flo that she's kind of been dragged down by wokeness, and there was a sort of weird wokerati reference, which was innovative for 2020, I guess. But
fan fiction. That's the fact that you said that that's where you came from. It starts to make a lot of sense now when I'm thinking about Penance as well, because.
yeah.
Because again, I was like, was that just hours and hours and hours of research going into that, or was it something?
In a way, it was hours and hours and hours of research just undertaken 15 years ago in my room while I was using Tumblr.com.
Yeah. Tumblr also featuring very, very heavily.
Yes, it features really. It's funny that I think it's one of the most dated things about Boy Parts is like the idea of an adult woman with a public Tumblr blog that she like dump posts to. I kind of think like, I feel like I wrote that I started writing it in like late 2017 and into 2018, and I feel like that's the last possible year. Now it would be a locked Twitter account.
Yeah. It's great because it tells you where you are as well. It's really helpful. It's funny how digital things have the ability to do that, isn't it? So, Penance. As you just said before you read the first bit, I read these. There was like 4 or 5 sunny days in the week, and these 2 books arrived from Faber so that we could have the conversation tonight. And I always like to read everything properly. And I read Boy Parts. I get to the end, it's like, whew, because it's amazing. It's a real page turner, So I read it really quickly, but. It kind of leaves its mark. I was waking up in the middle of the night thinking, have I got both my arms? Or might Irina have had one of them in the night? Because this sort of thing happens. And then I think, okay, let's go into Penance. I read the back cover. I read the quotes, gripping. I'm like great. And I think, I wonder where this one will go. Will it in any way be the same sort of novel? And it's not at all. I found it really. Immediately, like we're in a completely different world, but immediately we're not in a comfortable world. Like you say, I think it's like probably page 1, or certainly within the first, 2 or 3 pages. It doesn't really spoil the book because you're right there at the beginning.
Yeah.
But you've got 3 girls on one side of a chalet, and you've got 1 girl on the other side of a chalet, and the 3 girls outside the chalet, you don't really know anything about yet, but they've clearly done something really bad to the one inside. And it's incredibly graphic and incredibly dark, and that's how we begin. That's basically like,
That's why I don't read from it.
And then so I'm like, well, okay, this is where we're starting, and this is what's going on. But I was like, where's this going to go? Like, if that's page 1. But the devices you use in the book and the way in which you play around them with what happens next. Really surprised me, and we can get into some of that and why. But where did the impulse to want to write that story come from? Because it's completely different. It's such a departure from Boy Parts. Where did that start?
I was contractually obliged to write a second novel, which is
Might as well be that.
I wish that there had been more of a kind of like grand flash of inspiration for Penance, because I think it would have made it a much easier book to write. But I had signed a 2-book deal for Boy Parts. So for Boy Parts, and then for another novel to come out 2 years after Boy Parts. And I got, it was like, I think I got to sort of autumn of 2019, and I immediately became really paranoid about what people were going to say about Boy Parts, even though it wouldn't be out for another year. And I thought, the next book has to be something really different, because if I do the same thing again, I'm just going to get pigeonholed as like a young woman that writes about young women, and that will be it. And if it's not as good as Boy Parts, or if it's like even if it's like significantly better potentially, that that's gonna be me, and I'm not going to be able to do anything else either. So I think I'd had like an initial idea which was probably a bit more similar to Boy Parts, and then I thought I'm just gonna chuck that out, and I need to find something that's really different, but that is also like big enough to sustain a whole novel, because I don't know, you can often tell when an idea is a whole novel and when an idea is a short story. And I didn't really have any like big ideas at the time, so it was like quite pretentiously, to be honest. I just sort of had to think about like interesting things that I read about. I read a lot of nonfiction, and I pilfer a lot of stuff from nonfiction. The short story that I read there from She's Always Hungry, the title story from the collection She's Always Hungry, forthcoming in November. That was inspired by a chapter of Brian Master's Killing for Company, which is a book about Dennis Nilsson, and there's a chapter about the fishing villages in Aberdeenshire that he grew up in and around, and I was just so fascinated by that, and that ended up growing into this short story. So I like pinch a lot of stuff from nonfiction. So I was basically just thinking about like what's something that's different from Boy Parts, but not like so different that I won't be able to deal with it. So there were a couple of cases that I had really stuck with me about teenagers killing teenagers, particularly girls, killing girls, which had been probably the big kind of things that I pulled from would be the murder of Shonda Scherer in 1994 in the States, the murder of Suzanne Capper in, I think that was either 93 or 94 in the UK, which not a lot of people have heard of, even though it was a really awful, violent killing, because it happened at the same time as the Jamie Bulger trial. And then to a similar but a lesser extent, the Slender Man stabbing in the States in I think about 2014 that happened. And there was in a lot of cases, quite a lot of overlap with what had happened with these crimes. And I thought it was essentially just, it was something that was big enough that I could deal with it. And then I wanted to do something formally different. So I think initially I thought about maybe just doing a fictionalized version of a crime like that. And then I had the idea to do it as a fake nonfiction book. And that way I could bounce around between different topics, so I wouldn't just have to focus on the girls and their dynamic and different point of views. I could also talk about the history of the town that they live in, and I could basically just go off on tangents and be a little bit indulgent. And I think those also ended up being quite useful, so I could have the interview chapters, and then so essentially it'd give the reader a bit of a breather, because the book's very claustrophobic, and I felt very claustrophobic while I was writing it, and it was just nice to stop talking about this like awful, toxic girl friendship group dynamic while I was also kind of staring at a wall during lockdown and thinking about everything I'd ever done wrong and everything wrong that had ever been done to me, and therefore spending a lot of time thinking about high school. And it was nice to stop that and just to be able to write a chapter about a janky water park that people think is haunted.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and reading it as well, I definitely got that. I was like, oh, thank God, we're sort of going to rewind a bit or move somewhere else. Just because it's so intense, it's not that those other sections aren't brilliant, they are, but it's so intense, and you need that. You'd either have to put it down, but actually you do it, you turn the page and you go, okay, we're going somewhere else now, I can cope with this. I can not have my nerves on edge the whole time. But also that device as well of having, the fake fiction thing. So, this kind of like, it's like the preface to that first bit, so all of a sudden it's like, it's kind of like this is a book that had been published and retracted or had to be taken off sale. And so you've got a little bit of information about this journalist that's written a book, and then he's had to have the book removed from sale because of the sort of ethics around what he's done. He's used material he shouldn't really have used. And so all of a sudden you're in really deep, you're like, who is this guy? What's he done? He obviously doesn't have any morals or ethics or whatever, but and it tells you that the book you're about to read, that's a novel, is actually a non-fiction book that's been printed in full because they don't believe in censorship.
Yeah, that was actually taken from a real book which had been pulled from shelves and then republished by another publisher that had put quite a similar thing up front, which was like, we are presenting this for you to sort of consider without judgment, which I thought was interesting. And it was, I think I'd tried to write one on my own, and my editor ended up finding me this to base it on, so I could essentially so it could just sound a little bit more realistic, because I wasn't quite sure what you put in that kind of like weird legal note at the start of a book. But yes, it's I did that essentially both so you could come into the novel kind of questioning the authority and the truthfulness of the narrator, because we've already said that an unreliable narrator is just a good little get out of jail free card there. Good little we're maybe not going to do that as much in the next book, so it's no longer a crutch. But so you were kind of thinking about that all the time, because when I'd been doing research and thinking about the true crime books that I'd read, I was really interested in how much authority I was lending to the narrator, and how much I was kind of prepared to just take their word for it and to assume that they were operating in good faith and that they were telling the truth. And for the other reason that, like, I knew that I wanted to have the book ends with like a fake Guardian article, which is an interview of the fake narrator who wrote the fake book. I didn't want that to feel like a lame plot twist, because I feel like that would almost be, I don't know, very similar to doing a like, it was all a dream ending. Because I don't know, I didn't want it to feel like a cheap twist. I wanted it to be something that people would think about. Though sometimes I did get tagged in a review a couple of weeks ago where someone was like, there was just this really shit twist at the end. And I thought, oh no, she didn't read the first page. She missed the first page, which people sometimes do, because it looks like it's just sort of the guff at the start of a book.
yeah, or maybe she read it and didn't take it in or something. Yeah. I felt really a lot of sympathy with the other three girls, which I felt really bad about. But it was amazing when as the reader, when you're starting to then investigate the backstories and what led up to this moment. So all of a sudden, you're going back and you're led into their lives and what went on. And what looks like a very clear picture at the beginning, is almost completely reversed in the cases of some of the girls. And you're like, oh no, they were the one that was actually really bullied. They weren't actually the bully, it turns out, although everybody else around them thought they perhaps were. How was that for you to be able to sort of really in depth go into those characters? Because it gave you freedom. This structure gives you freedom to go all the way into who these people were in their lives entirely. Was that something you really enjoyed to do?
Yeah, it was really I scrapped a lot of stuff for Penance. I think I did a lot of like extra writing, which ended up being really useful for getting inside the characters' heads. Yeah. So there was quite a bad draft of Penance that was written it was still using the non-fiction book sort of framing device, but the chapters from each perpetrator's point of view were like written entirely by them, almost as like a straight monologue. So it was like 10,000 words of like obnoxious teenage girl voice, and it was unreadable. But it was really useful for I suppose it was a useful writing exercise for me to get inside their heads and to know exactly what each character's sort of version of it was. Like, I think I was thinking originally to have more of a like sort of asymmetrical kind of Rashomon style structure for this, where you would hear one character's recounting of the crime from the kind of them starting school in September and then round to the summer, and then you would get like that version again from another character's point of view and then from another character's point of view. But like I said, just doing it from one character's sort of perspective was some of the voices were very obnoxious, and I'm kind of. In a lot of ways, Penance is like an exercise in mimicry. There's a lot of different forms that are taken in, and the taking the decision to like mimic a teenage girl's voice for an extended period of time. I'm often quite happy to lose like quality of writing for the sake of realism, but it was too much quality out of the window, I'm afraid. So it went.
Then there's all kinds of characters that come in, some of which are very funny as well, even though you're dealing with this really dark subject, and actually other dark subjects. So you've got the UKIP dad.
Yes.
He's a great character, UKIP dad. He's like just thoroughly hateable, basically, all the way through the book, but also incredibly comedic. He's like the archetypal, I don't know, he's a politician as well, isn't he? And a successful businessman, and kind of makes things happen in the town, but he also covers things up and sort of moves money around so that certain things happen and other things don't. And you were writing this, did you say you were writing this during lockdown?
Yes.
So was he just basically like everything you hated at that moment in time?
Well, this is obviously everything in Penance is fictional, and that kind of disclaimer, but that's actually, so Penance, the town that it's set in, Crow-on-Sea, is quite heavily based on Scarborough, and my partner lived in Scarborough when he was a teenager, and a lot of our friends are from Scarborough, so I'd heard a lot of anecdotes from there, and that character is just basically whole cloth based on a real guy who I will not name because he is a public figure and I don't want to get sued, but yeah, it was that, but also I am quite interested in like these right-wing media grifter figures. I think they're I don't think they're good, but I think they're interesting. I think they're interesting in the way that a sort of they're interesting in the way that, like, I don't know, like foot surgery is interesting, where it's like, you know, I guess it's useful to learn about that so I know what it is, and but yeah, I don't know that, but that was, I mean, I was trying not to channel too much of my own like political frustration and penance, because it was. I already said that I was quite angry while I wrote Boy Parts. I feel like I was just sort of deflated while I wrote Penance. Yeah. And I think that, I don't know, it's funny, the sort of balance between sort of representing real life and fiction. I find that real life often just kind of beggars belief, and if you were to whole cloth put it in a book, it would just be ridiculous. And I found like I felt like I really wound that character in quite a lot. I think I could have made him a lot worse and a lot more cartoonish, and then I think you've also got the additional buffer of the context of the narrator having very different political views to him, and the idea that he'd like really quite deliberately and intentionally and maliciously misrepresented this character in his sort of retelling of their interaction. I think even to the point that you find out that like there are like recordings of this interview and it just isn't the way that he presented it at all. Though interestingly, I got like a proper hack job review in the Times for Penance, which was just like a screed about how mean I was about UKIP Dad. And it was very normal and very professional.
Well, yeah, I mean, UKIP Dad is probably the second worst character in that regard, though, because his mate's even dodgier.
Yes. There's a fake Jimmy Savile in it as well. Who's I believe Vance Diamond, I think his name is.
Yeah.
Which again, it was like there was a lot of the kind of stuff that there are a couple of things that I just pinched from like friends from Scarborough that had Jimmy Savile stories that were usually sort of benign if slightly sinister. Like I think I have a bit where I say that the kids like can see the fictional character's grave being moved from their playground, and one of our friends had said that he had basically watched them move Jimmy Savile's grave from his playground at school. Yeah. Which is quite cursed, but
and the fan fiction, you know, so where we started this bit plays a huge part in that as well, because some of the characters only know each other because they're reading each other's blog posts and stories, and actually a lot of the influence of what actually goes on with this really despicable act actually comes from influence from mostly America, it seems. How many of those podcasts did you actually have to listen to as well? Because there's all these like true crime podcasts, but again, like the people on them are often just awful, aren't they? You know, like they're kind of like making entertainment out of murder and suffering. But you must have listened to some of them because they're so well observed.
I used to listen to them quite habitually, to be honest. My relationship with true crime changed a lot while I was writing Penance, but particularly my relationship with like casual true crime consumption, and that I'd previously been just kind of like a casual listener. It's the kind of thing that I would listen to a true crime podcast while I was like cooking or whatever, and not really think about it too much, and just sort of absorb the fact that I'd had a like teenager's grisly murder described to me between a mattress advert and a Blue Apron advert or whatever, and they were like, I don't know, I just sort of didn't really used to think about it too much, but there were occasionally I would listen to them and I would think, that's too far, that's not funny, I don't like that, but it was kind of through true crime podcasts that I found out about a lot of the cases that I used for Penance. So I feel like I don't want to be too, I think sometimes people come away from Penance thinking that I hate true crime and that I don't engage with it at all and that I'm very heavily judgmental of it, whereas I think that it is sort of useful as I think high quality true crime has a really important place, and it's really useful for extending empathy to people who we wouldn't necessarily otherwise give empathy to, and to give a real sort of strong socio-political context to a crime, like things like Richard Lloyd Parry's The People Who Eat Darkness and Daniel James Brown's The Sleep of Reason. These are like fantastic and important works of nonfiction that should exist, but I think it was like after having done a lot of close reads of like high quality true crime books, and I really didn't listen to many podcasts. I kind of just gone off them a little bit anyway. And then doing a bunch of close reads of high quality true crime, and then kind of going back to podcasts to like, I think I just listened to one in the middle of writing Penance so I could double check some facts of a case, and I just wanted to do it quickly, and I was busy. And having it on and just finding it like vile. And particularly like, I think this one I was listening to was like just really, really nasty, really had like absolutely no empathy for the people they were talking about, no nuance at all. And then pausing for the standard, like, it wasn't actually a mattress advert, it was a home security advert that really got me. Which was like, because you stop and then it's like, they stop talking for here's, and now here a message from our sponsors, and it's like, are you a woman alone at night in a house who's just been listening to a podcast about a murderer? Would you like to spend $5,000 on a home security system? And it felt so predatory and so like, ugh. And then that was when the podcast transcripts went in, because it was just, I just couldn't quite like bring myself to but yeah, so I'm not anti true crime, but I'm anti lazy true crime podcasts that are nasty and disrespectful.
Yeah.
And a lot of them are really heavily plagiarized as well. Like a lot of them will just condense books and regurgitate them, which is not good.
Yeah. Well, I would definitely highly recommend both books, both of which are here tonight, and you can buy copies, and Eliza will kindly sign copies if you should wish. But should we finish with another reading?
Yes, we can do. I will read another story from my collection, but a different one. I was kind of wanting to gauge the vibe of the audience, and I thought I would read this one if you laughed. And you have laughed, so I will read this one, because there's nothing worse than telling a joke at a literary thing where it's like you're not primed to. I'm not primed to bomb the way that I would if I was a stand-up comedian or something. So if I tell a joke and it flops, it's really like. So this is from a story called The King. It is also in the forthcoming collection, She's Always Hungry, out in November. And this is part 1, and the title of part 1 of The King is Father, Forgive Me, I Am a Worm. My father told me we were once the rulers of this miserable planet. The consumption of human flesh imbued us with our victim's strength. We are young and beautiful, and we live forever. We killed, we carved, we consumed, and we conquered. He thought that when the current world came to its end, our people would exit our hiding and resume our natural position at the top of the food chain. Unless I'm the last one of us, which I might be. In which case, it's all for me, baby.
When the world ends, it'll be my time to shine. I wait in this apocalyptic whimper. I wait for another city to flood, for another tsunami, another hurricane. I wait for the bang, the nuclear bomb, the asteroid strike, some grand religious cataclysm. It was my father's wish that I be the one to restore us to our natural place, to pull down the thin curtain of human society and dominate as the light, the sun, the power. But for the moment, I work in tech. Officially, I am paid an insane wage to delegate work to other people and come up with innovative, new, stupid, abstract ways to advertise phones. Unofficially, I'm just killing time until the total collapse of society. I have sailed easily up to a senior position in marketing. As prey animals sensing something truly dangerous has entered their space, my colleagues bend to me. Their fear enables me to do silly things all day. I once spun around in my office chair till I did a big red sick on the carpet. Sometimes I play hentai games on my computer just to see if anyone will ask me to stop. Today, we have a marketing strategy meeting for the new phone. Without me, these people are lost. They would advertise the new phone simply by describing the features of the new phone, showing nice images of the phone and people using the phone. Amateur hour. What if we had an advert where people drop the phones into the water, but the phone is fine, I say. There's a girl who is both diverse and sexy in a non-threatening way. And she drops the phone into a pool, and then she gets in the pool, and the phone is fine, and she takes pictures with it under the water. Everyone in the room nods approvingly. There is a general hum of appreciation. They are impressed. Innovative, says the head of marketing. As always, you write the script, I'll allocate the budget. And then some guy from sales puts his hand up. My only concern here, and it's a brilliant idea, by the way, but my only concern is that while the phone is waterproof, it's not that waterproof, he says. Right, I say, but the water would be like yuppie and coloured. I pause. Everyone nods and pretends to understand how this would resolve the issue. So it wouldn't be like real water, it'd obviously be a metaphor, I add. For what? Says a new face in the room. She is standing behind the head of marketing, probably his new assistant. I find her diverse and sexy in a non-threatening way. She doesn't seem to look at me with despair or terror in her heart. In fact, she looks at me like I'm an idiot. And obviously I know I'm an idiot, but she isn't supposed to know I'm an idiot. Well, it's a metaphor for being fun and creative with your phone, I say. The other attendees at the meeting are now confident in agreeing with me. They all nod. Someone from the creative team points and laughs at the assistant. She looks confused and upset as if she has wandered into a madhouse. I am so sorry about her, says the head of marketing. Should I fire her? Nah, I say, don't worry about it. I check my watch. Well, I'm going to head out for my lunch break. See ya. But we're only halfway through the agenda, says the assistant. The head of marketing shushes her. I have my standard lunch, 2 cans of Diet Cola. I'm a carnivore by design, not by choice. I cannot digest plant matter. I cannot even cope with animal meat. Aside from water and human flesh, Diet Cola is the only sustenance I can tolerate. At home, I eat unseasoned human meat in different preparations. Herbs and spices make the food intolerable to me. I can manage a little salt, but that's about it. I will eat when I get home. I will take some flesh from my current food source, who is named Roy, and I will probably eat the meat raw, either minced or in thin, fancy slices. I don't need a lot to live. Human flesh is so nutritious for me, I can get by in a small amount. But it's been a long time since I was comfortable. The height of World War II, I think? Shortly after my father died, I think that's when I last felt full. My father always told me that hundreds of years ago we could eat and eat and eat, but things are too difficult now with police forces and post-industrial societies. When people go missing, dead or alive, their relatives generally expect them to turn back up. Things will be better when it's all over, but for now my stomach rumbles. Does anyone care if I go early? I ask. No, ma'am, says a man who I think is 2 or 3 pay grades above me. I live in a penthouse apartment, which was gifted to me by a millionaire I fucked and ate, as per his request. The service charge is mental. I go to say hello to Roy, who lives in a hospital bed in the kitchen. I have him catheterized, and he came pre-fitted with a stoma bag, which I personally find easier to clean than a bedpan. He lies in bed all day reading the books and magazines I leave for him, and he also has an iPad. I have all the subscriptions, so he can watch pretty much anything he wants. This all seemed like a fair exchange for his legs. I'm currently making my way up his left arm. Hello, Roy, I say. Kill me, Roy says. Not today, Roy, I reply. How long till the end comes? 63 days. Please kill me before it comes. Roy is an interesting case in that he's both a purveyor of doomsday prophecies and a sick, disgusting pervert who wants to slowly be eaten alive. I first found him on a doomsday prophecy subreddit where he was posting his doomsday prophecies. He made lots of correct predictions. He's predicted all sorts of natural disasters and all major points of escalation and hostilities with Russia. Ultimately, he thinks we'll go nuclear before the world boils, and then he thinks we'll be plunged into a permanent nuclear winter. This is fine with me. I prefer the cold to the heat. I, like many on the subreddit, had taken note of the accuracy of his prophecies. I had no intention to contact him until I saw the same username on a dark web cannibal fetish website. I was like, no way is this Doomsayer Roy from Reddit. So I messaged him. I said, OMG, are you the Doomsayer Roy from Reddit? And he said, all I want to do is have a beautiful, horrible woman eat me before the end of the world. I am begging you to eat me. None of these people are serious, but I can tell that you're serious. Please, 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 please tell me that you're serious. And I told him I was serious. Not only was I serious, I was this planet's apex predator. And when he met me, he said, you will become like a god after the end. You will lead my species to its oblivion. And I said, haha, cool. I climb into Roy's hospital bed and stroke his bald head. Tell me about the end, Roy, I say. When the firestorms end, the black snow will come, then grey, then white again, a virgin's bridal veil thrown over the raped and ravaged body of the land, and you will stain it red. Neat, I say. I love you, Roy. Your kind cannot truly love one so lowly as me. This was true, but I could love him in the way a farmer might love a really big cow or something. And that is the end of that paragraph.
So, books in the foyer, we're going to take a short break. Eliza Clark.